Our speaker today is Shalome Sine from the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation, also referred to as CISCRP. Shalome is a research associate at CISCRP, responsible for collecting and analyzing data from CISCRP's Perceptions and Insight studies, planning and executing patient advisory boards, patient interviews, and various other patient engagement activities. She is also pursuing a master's in public health at Tufts University. And prior to CISCRP, Shalome held several positions as a research assistant focusing on areas such as RNA studies, neuroscience and memory investigations, and the drug development processes. The Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation is committed to increasing patients' participation in clinical trials, so we are excited for Shalome's presentation and expertise on this topic. Be sure to join our Clinical Trial Innovation Series tomorrow and Friday to hear more about ongoing clinical trials in the pulmonary fibrosis space. I will now turn the presentation over to Shalome. Welcome, Shalome.
Hi, Jennifer. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really excited to be with you today, and I wanted to thank you again to the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation for having me. And like Jennifer said, so my name is Shalome, and I'm a research associate at CISCRP. We're the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation. And at CISCRP, we're dedicated to educating and informing the public, patients, medical and research communities, and others too on clinical research and the role that each party plays in the process. So today I will be talking about the, clinical research and why it's important to include the patient voice. So if we can go to the next slide. So most people don't understand what clinical research is all about. Some people are afraid. They may think that clinical research volunteers are treated like guinea pigs, or they've heard news stories about clinical trials that have gone wrong, or they still remember past abuses when there were no protections in place for clinical research volunteers. Or like many of us, they've heard stories more recently in the news about clinical trials for maybe COVID-19 vaccines. And they're starting to wonder what clinical trials are all about and how they work. So that's why at CISCRP, we believe in education before participation. We think the more people understand about research, the more they'll appreciate those who are research volunteers and feel empowered to make decisions about their health. So if we can go to the next slide. So first I wanted to show you a short video that gives a brief overview of clinical research. So if we can play that video. So I'm not hearing the sound coming through. Are you sharing the sound from the video as well? And if the video doesn't work, no worries, I can always just briefly recap. So basically what we would see in the video is that there are 4 main phases to clinical research, and each phase expands the participant pool a little bit more. So in phase 1, researchers all clinical research starts with a clinical research question, which is a scientific question that clinical researchers want to answer. And then studies go through phases 1, 2, 3, and 4 to test the drug that clinical researchers would like to test. And in each phase has a little bit of a different purpose, but each phase kind of builds toward making sure that drugs and therapies are as safe and effective enough so that they can reach patients and the public. So if you can go to the next slide, so I still don't hear the sound, unfortunately, but that's okay. We can go to the next slide if that's okay. Thanks so much. Again, clinical research studies start with a question. For example, how well does a new drug work or not work? Is there a better way to treat a disease like pulmonary fibrosis? How do genes affect illness? And does where people live change their health? What we learn from clinical research studies improves public health, and researchers can only answer these questions with the help of clinical research volunteers. So we can go to the next slide. Thanks. It's important to understand that being in a clinical trial is not the same as going to your doctor for care. So when you go to your doctor, he or she will give you a treatment that's already been tested and approved by the government. This is called routine or standard care. This is the care that we know works for most people. And it's the care that you would get if you went to the doctor for regular checkups or if you had a health problem. An example of standard or usual care is a person breaking their bone and the doctor applying a cast. We know it works for most people. An example of a clinical trial would be checking whether a new drug keeps breast cancer from coming back. You can go to the next slide again. So you can't fully understand something by just studying one group of people. And so, for example, we know that things like being male or female, age, race, and ethnic background, all of these things affect the way that people respond to diseases and treatments. So, for example, Alzheimer's disease happens twice as often in women compared to men. Type 2 diabetes and asthma are more common in African Americans compared to those who are white. Hispanics, Asian, and white women are more likely to develop osteoporosis than other groups, and children respond to drugs differently than adults. So that's why scientists need all different types of people to volunteer for research. We can go to the next slide. So clinical trials can be sponsored by the government, academic medical centers, pharmaceutical companies, biotechnology companies, or medical device companies. Importantly, just as a note, CISCRP doesn't sponsor any studies. We simply provide education to people about studies. You can go to the next slide. So research involves a lot of different people who do a lot of different things. And like members of a sports team, clinical trials have coaches, players, and officials, and each person has an important role to play. So over the next few slides, I want to go through the different people that you might meet if you participate in a clinical trial and kind of explain who they are in terms of who they would be on a sports team. So we can go to the next slide. So the principal investigator, also called the PI, is like the head coach. He or she is responsible for organizing and leading the study, as well as recording and studying all of the data. The PI also directs the team. And so like a team manager, the principal investigator follows a playbook, which in our case is called a study protocol. The protocol is a set of instructions that everyone in the game must follow. So it's the plan for how the study is going to be carried out. You can go to the next slide. So the research staff members are like the assistant managers who help the principal investigator. And so, for example, the clinical research coordinator will handle the day-to-day activity at the research site. He or she has easy access to the principal investigator, and they're the main contact for volunteers. So if you have any questions when you're participating in a trial about the trial itself, or if you have any questions about your health, this would be the person to ask, would be the clinical research coordinator. You can go to the next slide. So volunteer protections are in place in clinical research, just like referees are in place during a game. So referees help protect the safety of volunteers by making sure that teams follow the rules. So an example in clinical trials would be institutional review boards review the study before it even starts. The referees help to keep study volunteers safe and make sure that they are given all the information that they need during participation. The number and type of referees involved in a trial depends on the research being conducted. You can go to the next slide. So now let's talk about the most important members of the team, which are the research volunteers. So at CISCRP, we really believe that the research volunteers are the most important component of clinical trials, and they're very important for the clinical research process. So volunteers are like the players on the field, and without them, research can't happen. And again, we need all different types of people to participate in clinical research. And you don't even necessarily need to be sick in order to participate. A lot of research involves healthy volunteers too. You can go to the next slide. So another important part of the team are your friends and family who might provide you a support system while you're taking part in the study. It's a good idea to talk to your friends and family about the clinical study, because they can help you come up with questions to ask your doctor about the study. And they can also support you while you participate. But in the end, it's your job, and it's up to you to make the final decision about whether you want to participate in the study. You can go to the next slide. So everyone has the chance to participate in research. You just have to find the study that's right for you. So just like a football game, again, there are rules, and not everyone can be on the field at the same time. So the research team has a list of requirements for participants, just like the coaching staff of that draft players. Both the coaches and the players have to know the game and agree to work together. So let's talk about eligibility first. So for example, a 10-year-old would never be able or allowed to play on a pro football team for good reason, because it would be too dangerous. So just like in sports, clinical trials have eligibility criteria. And these are guidelines that say who can and can't be in a study. Eligibility criteria protect people if a trial might be too risky for them. And this helps researchers get results that are correct, that reach the target population that they're looking for, and results that really mean something. So if you're considering a trial, you have to be honest with researchers about your health. Lying or hiding information to get into a trial could endanger your safety and sometimes can ruin the study too. So it's important to kind of maintain open and honest communication with your doctors and the doctors in the clinical trial. You can go to the next slide. Thanks. So assuming the coaches say that you're eligible to play, the next question you would have to ask yourself is, do I choose to play? And that depends. It depends on a lot of different things, and it's really in the end up to you. And so you can't say whether or not you want to participate without understanding the rules of the game. And so what are your responsibilities as a player? How long will the game last? What are the risks and benefits of playing? And what are you going to get in exchange for playing? The informed consent process is designed to answer all of these questions and is required by the FDA and the IRB. This is one of the most important parts of research, and it's a term that you would hear a lot if you were going to participate in a trial. So before any volunteer can participate in a trial, he or she must read and understand and sign the informed consent form. This is a long form usually, and it lists your rights as a volunteer. It includes detailed facts about the trial, and it describes your job as a volunteer and any procedures or tests that you'll need to have. It'll warn you about any known and unknown side effects of the study drug, and it describes the benefits of participating in the trial as well. And by signing the form, you're saying that you understand the trial and you're agreeing to do what the study is asking to do. The informed consent form is a complex document, and the study staff should go through it with you carefully and answer all of your questions. Importantly, you should never feel rushed or pressured to sign this form. And again, whether or not you decide to participate is really in the end up to you. It's important to note that the IRB can ask the researcher to translate the informed consent form to a language that the volunteer speaks if they would like it to be translated. So we can go to the next slide. So as a research volunteer, you have rights. You have the right to understand the purpose, benefits, risks, and side effects of the clinical trial. You have the right to ask any questions and discuss any concerns with the research staff at any time during the trial. And you have the right to full, complete, and clear answers. Most importantly, you have the right to quit the trial at any time for any reason. So you're a volunteer and you're free to leave the trial if you choose to. If this applies to you and you're thinking about leaving a trial before it reaches its end, if you tell the research staff that you're planning on doing this, they can help you do this safely. So even though it's totally up to you and you can quit the trial at any time, we at CISCRP usually recommend that you notify people so that they can help you do so in a safe manner. We can go to the next slide. So I've talked a lot about clinical trials and your rights and responsibilities as a volunteer, but you might still be struggling with the most basic question, which is, should I participate or not? So deciding to take part in a clinical trial, again, is a very personal decision. What's right for the person sitting next to you or in the Zoom box next to you might not be what's right for you. And so in this section of our presentation, I'd like to talk about some of the risks and benefits that you can consider, and potentially some questions too that you can ask before making your decision. We can go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, I thought somebody said something. So scientists set up their studies so that their research will be fair. They also want their research to be accurate and unbiased. So in other words, they don't want their own ideas about what they think should happen in a trial to influence the results. To set up fair and unbiased studies, volunteers must be split into different study groups. So this is usually done by chance using a computer program, and it's similar to a coin toss. So the researcher and the volunteer don't get to decide which group the volunteer would be in. This is called a randomized study. Sometimes researchers will go a step further too and blind a study. So this would mean that volunteers and the researcher both don't know which treatment the volunteer is receiving. In some trials, researchers will also use a placebo, and a placebo looks like medicine but doesn't have any medicine in it. Sometimes the placebo is referred to as a sugar pill. What's interesting is that even though the placebo has no medicine in it, there are times when people who are taking the placebo improve or feel better during the trial. This is called the placebo effect. As a clinical research volunteer, even if you're on a placebo, you will still be closely monitored. Go to the next slide. So deciding whether or not to participate in a clinical trial is an important and, again, personal decision. And here are some reasons why people say they get involved in research trials. So one might be to get access to brand new therapies that are not yet available on the market. Another one might be to advance science and help others with their condition. And another one might be that the research staff will observe your health closely. Some people like that they're closely monitored when they participate in clinical trials. And so let's talk briefly too about compensation. So some but not all trials will pay for volunteers' travel costs and pay you for your time and commitment. These amounts vary widely, and there's really not a lot of consistency across the board. So getting paid at CISCRP, we don't necessarily think it's the main reason for volunteering, especially since you would need to really communicate with the study staff to determine whether financial reimbursement or compensation are involved. But again, it's a very personal decision that involves a lot of different factors. So you can go to the next slide. So all research involves risks because we're asking, again, a research question and we don't know what's going to happen. Researchers do their best to ensure that you are safe, but there are no guarantees. So you might need to be, you would need to be comfortable with the risks that you might experience. There can be physical risks, so you may not get better. There might be some undesirable effects that may make you feel uncomfortable. There's an emotional risk, so some clinical trials may ask you to take a quality of life survey to see how you're doing, and some of these questions can be upsetting or potentially cause distress. There's the financial risks. There could be a lot of out-of-pocket expenses, such as parking, childcare, and missing work, and like I just mentioned, whether or not there's reimbursement really varies from trial to trial. There's also a risk to privacy and confidentiality. So your health information is very private. When you agree to participate in research, you're giving permission for researchers to collect information about you. And again, these information collection methods should be disclosed as part of the informed consent process, and researchers have to follow certain rules that protect your privacy and your information. So you can go to the next slide. So it's important that all your doctors know if you are in a clinical trial. Clinical trials will require your time and commitment, and volunteering takes time and effort. So if you decide to participate, it's a good idea to be sure that you have the time to participate, and if you let the study staff know that it's not a good time, you can do that as well. And again, you can always stop your participation and volunteer in other ways or in future research. The clinical trial also could end at any time. So even if you wanted to continue to participate, your doctor, the quote unquote referees, or the company making the drug could stop the study. So be sure to ask these questions when you sign the informed consent form and sign up for the study. You can go to the next slide. Many volunteers drop out of studies because they didn't fully understand what they were signing up for. So both the volunteers and research suffer when this happens. And some ways to kind of avoid this problem would be to do your homework ahead of time. So learn about the trial and ask questions, read all the information provided by the study staff, and even go online to research the treatment being studied. The next thing to do would be to take your time. There's absolutely nothing wrong with asking a researcher to slow down or explain something using simpler words. And again, it's really, they are really never supposed to rush you or make you feel pressured to sign the informed consent form. Also asking questions, talking about your concerns with the study staff, your doctor, and your friends and family, bringing a friend or a family member to the study visit so they can ask questions too. And maybe trying to tape record your visits or take notes so that you can refer back to that information later and follow up with questions as needed. If you decided to join a study, you should feel confident that you have made an informed choice. So you should feel comfortable that the trial staff supported you and answered all of your questions. On the next slide too, we'll see some examples of some of these questions that you might ask. So if you're thinking about participating in a clinical trial, it's important to talk to your doctor and your friends and family and the clinical trial team to make sure that the trial is right for you. So on this slide are some examples of questions that you might ask before you decide to participate, like what's the purpose of the study, what are the risks and benefits, what will happen after my participation is over, and so on. You might find that you have many more questions, and that's a good thing. It's good to gather lots of information about the trial before you decide to participate. On the next slide, there's kind of a flow chart, and it's one way to kind of think about your decision to participate. And so you start by becoming aware of a certain study. You think you're interested, so you discuss it with your doctor. And if you're still interested, you need to know all the details. So you talk to the research staff and you find out whether you're eligible. If it sounds like something that's right for you, you can choose to sign the informed consent. But even when you're taking part in the study, it's a good idea to continue asking questions and decide whether you choose to complete the study or not. Informed consent is an ongoing process. So it's not just something that happens at the beginning of the study. It should be an ongoing process that really is a dialogue between the volunteers and the clinical trial staff. On the next slide, there are a few resources for where to go if you want more information. So if you want to learn more about clinical trials, the best place to start is with your doctor. You can ask them if they know of any clinical trials that might be a good fit for you. But you can also get information from your local research center, disease advocacy groups, medical journals and conferences. The Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation has a link here that you can go to for resources as well. There are a number of websites devoted to clinical trials, and some other ones are listed on the slide too for your reference. If you don't have access to the internet, which I'm sure that you do since you attended this meeting, but you can also call us at CISCRP, and we provide a free search service too for clinical trials. So on the next slide, there are a couple of ideas of ways to participate in clinical trials, participate in the clinical research process, even if you don't necessarily want to participate in a clinical trial. So one way would be to participate in observational studies. So these are studies which might ask you for medical information, but would not ask you to take an investigational drug. Registries are similar in that they ask you for your medical information, but registries tend to ask you about your information over a long period of time. Observational studies and registries always have protections in place to keep your information confidential. And these are some great ways to contribute to science and the treatment of diseases. Some patients also take part in advisory boards, and we have these often at CISCRP. And these advisory boards are groups of patients who meet to discuss the way that a clinical trial is set up. They advise the team conducting the trial on what they might need to know about people living with a specific disease or condition. And to get involved with an advisory board, you can consider asking the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation, or potentially reaching out to CISCRP too, or even asking your local study clinics if they are looking for people on any advisory boards where you might be a good fit. Another way of getting involved would be by attending and supporting awareness and educational events, just like the one that you're in right now. So on this last slide, I just wanted to thank you and highlight that research volunteers are medical heroes, and without them, medical science wouldn't be able to move forward. So I want to thank you again for taking the time today to learn about the clinical research process. And on behalf of everyone at CISCRP, I'd also like to say thanks to the millions of people who give the gift of participation in clinical trials each year. Thanks very much.